Here's Pascal, one of the first existentialists. When I consider the brief span of my life swallowed up in the eternity before and behind it, the small space that I fill, or even see, engulfed in the infinite immensity of spaces which I know not, and which know not me, I am afraid, and I wonder to see myself here rather than there. For there's no reason why I should be here rather than there, or now rather than then. Now, another thing the existentialists do that's very they're romantics. They're not Enlightenment rationalists. And part of the reason they're romantics is because they actually don't believe that life is rational. And Pascal's comment on what the existentialists often call thrownness is a description of the fundamental irrationality of life. It's like, okay, here you are. Well, why you? Why here? Why now? Why the way you look? Why with your family? Why your gender? Well, there's no answer to any of those questions. It's just how it is. It's blind and random chance, maybe. There's this, but even if it's not that, there's something arbitrary about it. And there's something that's arbitrary and not self-evidently just or fair. You know, because maybe you could have been born, you know, there are people around the world who make their living in garbage heaps, right? So there's whole families and whole societies that live out in the garbage dumps, and all they do is pick out, you know, the metal and glass that will enable them to sort of glean out a living. It's like, well, why the hell aren't you born there instead of, you know, sitting right here? So there's an irrational element to that, right? You can't justify it, you can't explain it, and you don't really even know what to do about it, right? I mean, do you owe an existential debt to the people who were born much worse off than you? Or is it just okay that it's that way? Well, it's a problem. That, by the way, is the problem the existentialists called thrownness, which is you're arbitrarily here in that form, and there's no explanation for it. And it's something that's outside of human concepts of, say, justice and equity and fairness and even sensibility. And then Pascal also points to the fact that, well, we're rather localized things, you know, you're right there, and there's a lot of what isn't right there around you, so you're a small thing against a big, infinitely large potential span of experience, and that's also an existential challenge. It's the challenge of the finite against the infinite, and that's also an existential problem, which is that it isn't your problem, or it is. It's more a problem. It's just a problem that springs out of being human. One of the places where existentialism and phenomenology touch, the phenomenologists, of course, make the case that reality is best conceived of as the totality of your experience, even if that includes things that you wouldn't normally consider you. But certainly it includes things like emotions and motivations and bodily sensations and all the things that aren't precisely rational. The existentialists would take that claim and push it a bit farther by saying, and this is analogous to something I already told you, that the degree to which that phenomenological field, your field of experience, is fractured and incoherent and paradoxical, that occurs in precise proportion to the weakening of the spirit within you that necessarily has to be strong in order to remain uncorrupted by the tragic conditions of existence. So along with the existentialist claim, which is that life is unbearable in its very nature, it's tragic and unbearable in its very nature, is the idea that that's made worse by your own set of inadequacies that you could repair, and worse, that to the degree that you are rife with inadequacies that you could repair, you're going to make the tragic situation that's integral to life worse. Again, not only for yourself, but also for other people. So out of existentialism also automatically arises a kind of moral necessity, which is that you can't just sit in isolation and be useless and resentful. That doesn't work. If you're useless and resentful and you refuse to address the things that you know you should address, you can't help but pathologize everything around you. And so you're stuck with a moral duty. And the existentialists would say more than that. They would say that if you don't shoulder that existential burden, that existential moral burden, you will inevitably suffer for it. You cannot get out of it. You're stuck with it. So existentialists are great believers in free will, in that you have choice. But the free will has parameters, right? There are still things that you can't get away with. And one of them is you fundamentally can't get away with being immoral. The structure of existence is set up, well, one of the things you might say, if you were thinking about it existentially, is immoral things are precisely those things that you can't get away with. That's why people have identified them as immoral, is that they will inevitably, the consequences of enacting them will inevitably be brought to bear on you or on the people you love, or it'll snap back in some way. You know, and I see this in psychotherapy very often too. People will engage in the same kind of behavior over and over. Well, there's a classic definition of insanity, which is insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different outcome each time. And there's an element of self-deception in that. It's like people will run out a procedure that ends in tragedy, and then they'll repeat that over and over, and you can lay out for them the causal connection between their actions and their conceptions and the outcome. And they'll listen. But there's no change whatsoever in behavior, and so then they run through the routine again, and bang! And what they're doing is immoral precisely because whenever they implement it, it produces the kind of catastrophe they claim to want to avoid. Because, you know, relativists, modern relativists, like to think of morality as something that's just arbitrary, like it's a cultural construction. You know, and society 1 thinks that A is bad, and society 2 thinks that B is bad, and when you get right down to it, there's no commonality underneath all that. But the existentialists sort of undercut all that, and they just say, well, what's immoral are those things that you could change, that you do, that result in outcomes that are catastrophic for you. That's it. That's what immoral is. And so that's universal, because it doesn't really matter what the details are. You know, like what you do that's immoral could be very much different than what you do. It might be temperamental. You know, we're each in our own playing field in a sense. But there's a commonality underneath that, which is, well, for example, you won't get away with deceiving yourself. You just can't. And the reason you can't is because you need a model of the world that's like the world. And if you try to live in a model of the world that isn't like the world, you'll just bump into the world. And so the deception brings with it its own punishment. And that's why it's immoral.